I was 17 when we stole the signal core, and I have not been warm since. That is not a complaint. Warmth is something you stop expecting after the first winter under occupation. And I had already survived 2 of them in the highlands before the run north. What I mean is something more specific. There is a cold that lives in a person after they have done what I did in the ice above Saltdal, a cold that the body never quite expels, that sits in the sternum and behind the eyes and reminds you, in the small hours, that you went somewhere the living are not supposed to go and came back without all of yourself. I'm not complaining, I am explaining. Those are different things. My brother Kel was 14. He had our mother's coloring. Dark hair, pale skin that flushed red across the cheekbones in cold wind, which meant he was always red-cheeked up there. Always looked like he was embarrassed about something, when in fact he was just alive. He was small for his age, and quiet in a way that was not weakness. He watched things. He remembered what he watched. 2 qualities kept him alive more than once on the road north, and I want to say that plainly before I say anything else, because I have heard the stories told wrong. People say I saved him. That is not the story. We saved each other, and the second half of that equation gets left out too often. The Veth had held the northern provinces for 11 months when we ran. I want you to understand what 11 months of Veth occupations looks like, because it is not what people outside imagine when they think of an alien occupying force. They picture something dramatic, warships overhead, columns of soldiers in the streets, fires and monuments. That is a human imagination projecting human occupation onto something that does not think the way we think, does not value what we value, and does not need the spectacle because the spectacle is not for them. The Veth did not want us to see them as conquerors. They wanted us to stop being relevant. They moved into the infrastructure first, the power grid, the fiber lines, the rail corridors. They did not destroy them. They absorbed them. Overnight, a Veth relay node would appear at a junction point, a structure like a closed hand, black and smooth, and about the size of a transit shelter, sunk into the ground on routes that nobody could find the end of. Within days, everything downstream of that node was theirs. Not monitored, owned. The electricity that ran your heat still ran. The water pressure in your pipes held. But the house was no longer yours in any meaningful sense, and the house knew it. And if you paid attention, you could feel it in the way certain electronics cycled at odd intervals, and certain lights held a fractional extra second before responding. People argued about whether that counted as occupation. The ones who argued were, in my experience, the ones who still had heat. In the camps it was different. Processing centers. We called them camps. The Veth called them something that translated roughly as resource coherence stations. And the translation gets less funny the longer you think about it. Were not death camps in the old war sense. People did not disappear into them and never emerge. What happened was more patient than that. You went in. You were assessed. The assessment took a variable amount of time, from 3 days to 3 months. And nobody outside could predict the duration, and nobody inside could explain what was being assessed. When you came out, you were physically intact. You were also, uniformly and without exception, quieter than when you went in. Compliance was not a word any of the emerged ever used. They did not talk about what happened. They simply did not cause problems anymore. They worked the assignments given. They ate what was provided. They did not gather in groups larger than 4. Our father came out of the Bodo facility in month 7. We recognized his face. That was about the limit of what we recognized. He moved back into the house. They let him do that, the Veth, because they were not interested in disruption. And a man returning to his house was not disruption. Cooked. He answered questions in single sentences. He slept regular hours. On the 3rd morning after his return, I came into the kitchen, and he was standing at the window, looking out at the birch stand at the property's edge, and I said his name, and he turned. And I could see that he recognized me, that the mechanism of recognition was intact, but behind it was something like distance. Not coldness, not hostility, just an absence of the urgency that a parent is supposed to feel when they look at a child. I was a fact to him. I had been something else before. Kel watched him for 2 days without saying anything. On the 2nd night, after our father had gone to bed, and we were in the kitchen in the dark with lights off, because the Veth relay nodes registered elevated power consumption as household activity. And we had learned to manage our footprint. Kel said, "We're not staying." I had been thinking the same thing for 6 weeks. I had not said it because saying it made it a plan, and plans have weight, and weight has consequences, and I was not sure I was ready for the consequences. Kel said it, and once it was said it had to be answered, and I answered it the only way I could. We spent 4 days preparing without appearing to prepare. We gathered what we could move without drawing attention from the relay node's activity monitoring. Food was the hardest. We had learned that sudden inventory reductions in household supplies registered as an anomaly worth flagging. So we took things incrementally, a day's worth at a time, replacing what we could with similar mass, so the weight difference in storage was negligible. Kel had thought of that. I would not have thought of it as quickly. We did not say goodbye to our father. I have thought about that more than almost anything else from that period. We left a note, plain language, nothing that would mean anything to a Veth reader but which we hoped would mean something to the man who had come home. It said, "We have gone north. We will try to come back. The house is yours." Those 3 sentences. I do not know if he understood them the way we meant them. I know we left them. We left in the dark before first light on the 5th day. We did not intend to steal the signal core. I want to be honest about that. The original plan, if you can call a 17-year-old's 4-day scramble of terror and practical reasoning a plan, was to reach the highland roads north of Fausk, follow the old reindeer migration paths up through the plateau, cross into the uninhabited zone above the Veth's northern deployment limit, and disappear into the kind of country that does not care who you are or who is looking for you. That was the plan. Survive by becoming irrelevant. Become irrelevant by becoming unreachable. It was not a heroic plan. It was the plan of someone who had watched what heroism costs and made a different calculation. Relay stations changed the calculation. We came across it in the pre-dawn dark of the second night out, moving along a cut-through scrub birch that had been a logging access road before the occupation. The station was new. Less than a week installed, I estimated from the soil disturbance around its anchor roots, which had not yet fully settled. It sat at a crossroads of 2 old forestry tracks, and it was live. The signal emissions were visible to the naked eye in the dark. A faint rhythmic pulse of blue-white light along the root structures, like slow breathing. What I knew about Veth relay stations. They formed the neural network of the occupation. Every camp, every patrol route, every absorbed infrastructure node communicated through them. Without the relay network, Veth unit cohesion degraded. They did not lose the ability to fight. They lost the ability to coordinate. They lost the ability to route pursuit units. They lost, for a critical window, the ability to know where every human being in their zone of control was located. What I knew about the signal core inside a relay station. It was extractable. One of the men, who had passed through the loose network of runners in the highlands, a former communications technician from Rama named Dahl, who had spent 3 weeks in a cache near our property before continuing his route east, had explained the architecture with the resigned thoroughness of someone who knows the information will be used by someone eventually. Core seated in a socket at the base of the relay column. Quarter turn counterclockwise, a pull that required about 40 kilograms of force. The node went dark. You moved immediately, within 90 seconds. You were outside the automated alarm radius before the station registered the disconnection. Dahl had also said, "Don't do it unless you are very sure about very fast." Those were his exact words. Could hear them in his voice as I crouched at the station base and felt the socket housing with my fingers in the dark. Kel was at the scrub line, watching the road south. He did not say anything. The absence of him saying anything was its own instruction. I did not decide in the way you decide things when you have time and safety and distance. I decided the way you decide things in the dark, with the cold working through your jacket, and the understanding that everything downstream of this moment is going to be different regardless. So you might as well shape the difference. Core came out on the first attempt. Quarter turn counterclockwise. 40 kilograms of resistance, and then sudden release. The socket housing flexing open, and the core in my hands before my arms had fully processed the motion. It was about the size and weight of a hardback book, smooth with the same black glass surface as the relay housing, warm to the touch in a way that felt biological rather than electrical. It gave off no light once extracted. The station went dark the moment it seated free of the socket. The root pulse dying like a candle snuffed. Counted in my head, moved at a run. Cleared the scrub line with Kel already moving ahead of me. Already on the track north. Already not looking back. We had 90 seconds. We used 73. Behind us, perhaps 200 meters back through the birch, the dead station began to send its absence signal. A different kind of pulse, tight and rapid, the Veth equivalent of an alarm. I heard it more than I felt it. A subsonic throb in the back molars, the way you feel low bass through a floor. Kel said quietly without breaking stride, "They know," I said. "Yes, we ran." The Veth send after a relay theft is not a patrol unit. Patrol unit is what they send after a curfew violation or an attempted camp breach. What they send after a signal core extraction is a pursuit unit, and the distinction matters in ways that took me some time to understand and then wished I hadn't. A Veth pursuit unit is 3 individuals and a coordinator. The individuals are what the occupation briefings, the ones that circulated in crumpled printouts through the Highland Runner networks, called trackers. Coordinator does not physically move with the unit. The coordinator is the signal. The trackers are the body. Relationship between them operates on frequencies that human instruments could not measure in 11 months of trying. What this means practically: the trackers do not communicate with each other the way you or I communicate. They move as a single distributed organism. One of them stops, the other 2 continue. The one who stopped has identified something, a thermal trace, a pressure imprint in soft ground, a vibration pattern, and that information is in all 3 of them instantaneously, without transmission lag. You cannot lose them by splitting up. They do not lose halves of themselves. You cannot lose them by doubling back. They do not retrace their own logic. You cannot outlast them. They do not tire in any way that corresponds to how humans tire, and they do not require sleep in the intervals that human physiology demands. The only documented successful evasions in our runner network had one common element: extreme cold. Temperatures below -25 Celsius, sustained for 3 or more hours, degraded their thermal tracking capability to the point where they were operating on older data. They did not stop hunting. They hunted toward where you had been. If you were very good at not being where you had been, there was a window. The highlands above Saltdale in January can give you -35 on a clear night. I did not know yet that this was where we were going. We were going north and up, and that each kilometer north and each 100 meters of altitude was a degree colder, and that cold was the only weapon available to us. The signal core in my pack was heavy in a way that felt heavier than its actual weight. The weight of what it meant, what it could do if we got it to someone who could use it, what it would cost if we failed. I had not yet made the decision to try to deliver it rather than simply carry it and survive. I was running. That was the whole of my cognition for the first 4 hours. Running and breathing and watching the ground and watching Kel and making sure Kel was still there. He was always there. I want you to understand that about him. We made the plateau edge before first light. The highland plateau north of Fauske is not dramatic landscape in the way tourists once paid to see. It is not fjords or glacier faces or the craggy silhouette peaks that end up on calendars. It is enormous and flat and uninterested in you. The ground alternates between frozen peat, scree, and the kind of dense low scrub, dwarf birch, heather, crowberry, that is only knee-high and nonetheless can grab your boot and put you face down in a second if you stop paying attention. In summer, it is all of this under a gray sky that never goes fully dark. In January, it is all of this in 18 hours of darkness, and 6 hours of a sun that barely clears the southern ridge line and contributes more light than warmth. We had been up here before. Summers for the last 3 years had included stretches above the tree line first, with our father, before, and then alone, the 2 of us maintaining the routes and caches the runner network relied on. We knew the plateau the way you know a difficult relative. Its moods, its shortcuts, its places where the permafrost was unreliable underfoot, its specific cruelties. We were not comfortable here. Nobody is comfortable here. But we were not strangers, and there is a difference. The Veth trackers, as far as anyone in the Highland network had established, had spent exactly 0 winters above the tree line in the northern provinces. That was an asymmetry. I kept it close. The first day on the plateau we covered 18 kilometers before the cold forced a stop. We had a lightweight shelter between us. A compact emergency bivvy of the kind the runner network stocked in the Highland caches. Rated to -40, small enough to hold in one hand when packed. We found cache 3 at the rock formation the network called the Thumb. Ate what was there. Dried protein blocks, rehydration salts, 2 fuel canisters, and held position for 4 hours while the temperature outside dropped below -20, and the wind came up hard from the north. Kel said, "Do you think the core actually does what the technician said?" I said, "I think if it doesn't, we've had a very bad idea." He did not smile. He had stopped smiling sometime in the last 12 hours, which was fair, but he said, "Well, we'll know eventually." And then he slept, because he could do that. Set himself to sleep with the discipline of someone who understood sleep as maintenance rather than luxury. I watched the shelter walls and listened to the wind and felt the core's weight against the small of my back, where I had it strapped under 2 layers. And I thought about what it would take to get it north. We had seen no sign of pursuit on the plateau. That meant either we were ahead of it, or it was operating without visible sign, which was equally possible and more worrying. The second day was harder. The wind had shifted east overnight, which changed the effective temperature on exposed skin and made navigation by the sun angles we had learned. The flat, low-trajectory light of winter, more difficult by reducing visibility to under 200 meters in blowing spindrift. We navigated by ground. The plateau has its own grammar if you know how to read it. The way the heather bends under prevailing wind over months tells you cardinal direction more reliably than a sun you cannot see. The scree fields run in specific patterns that correspond to slope angle and elevation gain. The frozen peat has a sound underfoot, a particular hollow resonance that tells you whether the permafrost below it has cracked and whether the next step is safe. These are things you learn over time in a place like this. They are not things you can be briefed on. Free that lives in the body, not the mind. We covered 12 kilometers before the spindrift dropped, and the cold reasserted itself without the wind, which is a different kind of cold. More patient, more total, less violent. We sheltered in a depression beside a scree moraine, dug into the lee side with our hands and the folded shelter material, and ate again and waited for the temperature to signal its nature before moving. The coldest point of a winter night in the Highlands comes about 2 hours before dawn, and after it passes, the air has a different quality, something almost like softening, though that word is relative. I sat my watch and let Kel sleep through the worst of it. There is a quality to the dark at high altitude in January that is different from the dark at sea level. Below the tree line, dark has texture, the shape of branches, the differential shadow of hillside and valley, the diffuse glow that even a moonless sky holds above a snowfield near habitation. Above the tree line, in the plateau bowl, there is no reference. The dark is total, and the ground is the same dark as the sky, and the wind erases the line between them. You lose your sense of where you are in space, and become only a point of warmth in an environment that is working patiently to reclaim that warmth as its own. After enough hours of it, you stop experiencing it as threatening. It becomes the condition. You are an animal in it, and the animal knows how to function, and that is enough. In the early hours of that second night, alone with the cold and the dark and the absolute absence of any sound that did not come from wind or the occasional creak of ice expanding in the scree, I found myself thinking about the question of what we were doing with the core. We had taken it on impulse. Not reckless impulse, but the kind of impulse that is informed by everything you have been paying attention to for 11 months, compressed into a moment, and then acted on before the rational mind could find a reason not to. The rational mind would have found one. The rational mind in occupied territory learns very quickly to generate reasons not to act. Because action has costs and inaction has the cost of living in the world as it is. And the rational mind can make a case that the world as it is survivable. The rational mind does not account for faces through wire. What we had was something the Veth needed back. Not wanted, needed. The difference between wanting and needing is the difference between an inconvenience and a vulnerability. The network technician had explained the architecture but not the dependency, and I had sat with the dependency question since the extraction, and what I had worked out alone in the dark over those 2 nights was this. The Veth relay network was not just communications infrastructure. It was the occupation's nervous system. The camp assessment processes, the compliance maintenance protocols, whatever they had done to the people who came out quieter, all of it ran on relay signal. Without the signal, the maintenance degraded. Without the maintenance, whatever they had done to those people had a half-life. I did not know if that was true. Could not verify it. It was the logical extension of the architecture as Dahl had described it. And if it was true, then what we were carrying was not just a tactical asset. It was a key of a particular kind. Not to a door, but to a lock that was already around people we knew. Around our father. I sat with that through the nadir of the night. Kel woke. I did not tell him what I had been thinking. Not because it was not worth telling, but because the thinking was not done. And half-finished thoughts in the dark have a way of becoming burdens before they become maps. I gave him his share of the food, and we moved before first light. And I carried the possibility alongside the core's weight, and did not put it down. On the second day, we found Birta. She was at Cache 5, which she should not have been. Cache 5 was a solo resupply point. Too exposed for habitation, marked in the network for a 20-minute stop maximum, and she was in bad shape. Injured, but depleted in the specific way that comes from sustained cold stress and inadequate caloric input. Slow, slightly confused, prone to fixed stares at middle distance. She had been beautiful once in a way that the cold had revised but not erased. She was perhaps 40 years old. She had been a harbor master at a small coastal village west of Bodo that no longer existed in any meaningful sense, having been absorbed and restructured by the Veth early in month 3. She had been moving on the plateau for 11 days. She had information. The Veth had responded to the relay theft. She told us. She had been close enough to the network edge to pick up the signal disruption and the subsequent communications burst, which meant the extraction had in fact propagated through the wider relay system before it crashed. We had taken out not just the Fausk node, but 3 secondary nodes downstream that had been routing through it. The disruption had covered a 40-kilometer radius for, she estimated, from the duration of signal absence she had observed through equipment she still carried from her harbor work. Approximately 4 hours before rerouting compensated. 4 hours of blind coordination in a 40-kilometer zone. She said it quietly, as a report. Kel and I were sitting across from her, in the cache shelter, which was barely large enough for 3 people. She looked at us after she had said it, watching to see if we understood what she was telling us. I said, "People moved," she said. 11 people walked out of the Bodo camp perimeter in that 4-hour window. There may have been more elsewhere in the zone. 11 is what the network confirmed. Kel looked at the floor. He did not say anything. I did not say anything for a moment either. We had been running. We had not known there would be a downstream effect. Had not calculated for a downstream effect. Had acted on impulse and practical reasoning, and the compressed weight of 11 months of watching. And the thing we had done had made a window in the wire that 11 people walked through. 11 people, one of whom I could not help but calculate might have been the kind of person who might have come back different from what they went in. I did not say that. I stored it where I stored the other unfinished thoughts and held myself to the present. Ta said, "There are 3 of them above the ridge line." She meant Veth. "Pursuit unit," she said. "I have been watching them for 2 days. They move in a pattern I have mapped. There is a gap. A geographical gap, a gully system on the northwest face that runs below their detection floor. It closes in approximately 40 hours as the unit rotates its search pattern north. Then the gap is gone." She drew the gully system in the frost on the shelter floor with one finger. She drew it with the precision of someone who spent decades navigating water and terrain for work. Not just the outline, but the relevant dimensions, the gradient of the descent, the ice conditions in the lower section, the 2 points where the walls narrowed enough to require a sideways traverse. She drew it from memory. and it was the clearest map I had seen since the occupation. Better than anything in the network's printed stock. I memorized it. Kel memorized it. Then she smoothed it away with her palm. She said, "I'm not going with you. Too slow. I would cost you the gap." She said it without drama. Not resigned, not apologetic, not asking to be argued out of it. She said it as a calculation, delivered as a fact, the way she would once have told a vessel captain that the harbor entrance was closed due to ice. I said, "You can stay in the cache. We'll send people back from the network's northern point." She looked at me the way older people sometimes look at younger people who have said something technically true, but practically hollow. She said, "Yes, do that." And she gave us the last of her fuel canisters without being asked and told us to move at night. And told us one more thing. The name of the person at the northern relay point. A name that turned out to be correct. A detail she had no way of verifying but which she gave us with the same quiet confidence she had given us the map. And then she turned back to the entrance of the cache and looked out at the plateau. We moved at night. The gully was exactly as she had described. A cleft in the plateau face, carved by seasonal meltwater and now frozen solid, below the angle from which the Veth tracker's ground pressure sensors apparently operated. We found this out because, as we entered the gully's lower mouth, no more than 300 meters below the ridge where we knew the trackers were holding position, nothing happened. We moved slowly, one careful step at a time on the ice-glazed rock, and nothing detected us. The silence above was not the silence of absence. It was the silence of something very patient in the dark. It was not moving. We were in the gully for 3 hours. The lower section was the worst of it. 120 meters of descent on ice that had the consistency of wet glass, sloped at an angle that was manageable in summer conditions, and genuinely dangerous in January in the dark. We moved it on our backs, descending feet first, with one hand dragging on the rock wall to control speed, the other pressed flat against the ice surface. Kel went first. I watched him negotiate each meter from above, and when he was at the bottom and standing, I followed, and we reached the lower exit together, and stood breathing in the dark, and neither of us said anything about the drop we had just come down. At the upper end, crossing the exposed ridgeline, required what Berta had called the window. 12 minutes between the eastern tracker's transit point and the coordinator's signal rotation, when the northwest quadrant was at maximum coverage gap. We timed it by the subsonic trace we had learned to feel in the back teeth, the same carrier frequency as the alarm signal, but operating at a different harmonic, the one the trackers used for active search. When it cycled to its minimum intensity, we moved. We crossed the bridge in 4 minutes at a run. We did not speak. We did not look at each other. We made the far side. The third day, we were above 2,000 meters, and the temperature had dropped to something I could not measure, but could only estimate from physiological response. The point at which breath freezes before it disperses, at which the eyes begin to feel the cold specifically and not just the skin around them, at which the sensation of cold passes through pain and into the territory that physicians call cold anesthesia, which is not as comfortable as it sounds. We were well past the Veth's documented operational ceiling. Not past pursuit. The unit was still behind us. We could feel the carrier frequency in the geology below our feet when conditions were right. But past their peak efficiency, and efficiency is everything when what you're tracking does not want to be found. Kel's hands were the problem. He had first-generation frostbite on 3 fingers of the left hand from a slip earlier that morning. A moment where he had grabbed rock with a bare hand to arrest a fall. Instinct overriding the discipline we had both developed about keeping hands covered at all times above the tree line. Serious yet. The skin still supple under the white patches, the tissue not yet crystallized, but progressing, and both of us knew the trajectory. We stopped in the lee of a boulder formation, and I did the only thing that works for early frostbite, which is the thing nobody wants to do, but everyone who has spent time in serious cold knows to do. I took his hand and held it against my stomach, under my layers, and we stood like that in the wind for 20 minutes without talking. The skin of his fingers against my skin was shockingly cold, and then gradually not. That is the whole of the treatment. It is not dramatic, it works. He said eventually, in a voice that was more focused than I expected from someone whose hand had just been rewarmed. The core. If do we give it to? I said. Marty's network, the northern relay point. Person named Odd. If Berta's information was right, he said, and if they're not running anymore, I said. Then we figure that out when we know, he said. Einar, I need you to tell me this goes somewhere. I'm not asking for a guarantee. I'm asking for a reason to still be walking. I thought about our father's face through the wire. I thought about the face that came home afterward, recognizing me with the mechanism of recognition that was still intact. I thought about Birta in the cash shelter, with her fuel canisters and her careful harbor master's memory. I thought about 11 people in a 40-kilometer window walking through a gap that had not existed before we pulled a piece of black glass out of a socket in the dark. I said, it already went somewhere. Whatever else happens from here, it already did something real. 11 people have been walking for 4 days somewhere south of us because of 4 hours we made them. That happened. Nothing takes that back. He was quiet. His hand was warming against my skin, the color returning slowly to the damaged fingers, the white patches softening back to red. For a while he flexed them one at a time, testing. Then he said, okay. I knew he meant more than okay. The same way he had meant more than we're not staying when he said it, in the dark kitchen at home. Kel said things that carried more weight than their surface suggested, and I had learned over 14 years of knowing him to receive the weight rather than just the surface. We moved. What happened at the Saltdal ice field is the part of the story I have been asked to tell correctly, because people tell it wrong in 2 different ways. First wrong version makes it heroic. 2 boys against 3 alien hunters on a frozen wasteland. The boys whizzing through courage and determination. The second makes it desperate. 2 boys nearly dying by accident. The alien falling through ice by chance. Luck mistaken for strategy. The truth is more technical than either. And the technical truth is the one that matters, because it is the one that explains how 2 boys without weapons or training beat a Veth pursuit unit in open terrain. And understanding how that happened is more useful to you than understanding how it felt. It felt like nothing. That is the honest answer. By the time we reached the ice field, I had passed through fear into a kind of cognitive clarity that had nothing personal in it. I was not brave. I was past the point where bravery is a meaningful category. I was functioning, and function was all there was. The ice field above Saltdal is one of the few remaining glacial remnants in the northern highlands. It is approximately 4 kilometers in its widest dimension, and sits in a boulevard formation between 3 ridge lines, exposed on all sides to wind, and at an altitude where the temperature differential between the ice surface and the air above it creates a sustained microclimate roughly 8 to 12 degrees colder than the surrounding plateau. In January, in clear conditions, the ice field surface temperature approaches -45. We reached its southern margin at midday. The sun was at its maximum elevation for January, barely 15 degrees above the southern horizon, and the light across the ice was flat and shadowless, the kind of light that removes depth cues and makes distance estimation unreliable. The ice field looked like it was painted on rather than real. A too flat white that went to gray at the edges of visual range. The Veth trackers were at the southern approach behind us. I could feel them in the carrier frequency, which had been cycling at its active search harmonic for the past hour. They were close, maybe 2 kilometers, maybe less. The gully and the ridge crossing had bought us time, not distance. And time was running out in the specific way that it runs out when what is behind you does not rest. Made the decision at the margin. The plan was not heroic. The plan was geometric, and it rested on 3 things I knew, and 1 thing I was uncertain about. What I knew, the ice field surface is deceptive. It appears uniform, and it is not. There are pressure ridges. Old melt channels refrozen at odd angles. Sections where the ice thickness changes abruptly, and the thermal conductivity with it. Kel and I had crossed this particular ice field once before, 2 summers prior, as part of our highland route maintenance. We had crossed it in August when the surface was partially open, and we had noted the channel system, and Kel had made me stop at one point and told me to feel the surface through my boot, and when I did, I felt the subtle deflection under the ice that meant a pressurized melt channel was below. Water, still moving in August, Still moving in winter, still carving. And he had said, remember that. Don't cross there. I had remembered it. What I knew, the Veth trackers had not crossed this ice field. Nobody who had been in the highlands for less than 2 winters had crossed this ice field. It was off the network routes. Too exposed, too high, no caches. And the occupation had not pushed above the deployment ceiling that would have put Veth units anywhere near it. They were coming onto an unfamiliar surface in a temperature environment that was already degrading their sensor baseline. Confidence in their sensor data would be high regardless, because their confidence was always high. That was a characteristic documented in every evasion account the network had compiled. The Veth trusted their instruments. The thin ice section was on the western margin, 140 meters from the southern entry, at a diagonal that read visually as the straightest line toward the northern exit. A direct line. The kind of line a sensor-guided unit routing for efficiency would select. What I was uncertain about, whether the cold had reached far enough into their biology to degrade not just their tracking sensitivity but their thermal assessment, specifically their ability to read ice thickness from surface temperature differentials. At -45, the temperature of the ice above the pressure channel was fractionally different from the surrounding surface. Perhaps half a degree warmer, because the moving water below was warming the ice from beneath. A thermal sensor, at full efficiency, would catch that. A thermal sensor operating at degraded capacity in an environment 12 degrees past its design ceiling might not catch it. I was uncertain. I was also out of options. I told Kel what I needed him to do. He listened without interrupting, which was how he always listened to operational information. When I finished, he was quiet for 3 seconds, which was how long it took him to fully process what I had described. Then he said, the Eastern Moraine. I said, yes. He said, how long do I give it? I said, until you know. Then walk south until you reach the network route and follow it north to the relay point. Do not wait for me. He looked at me. The wind was in his face, and his cheeks were red, and he looked like a 14-year-old boy on a school walking trip. He said, I'm not agreeing to that last part. I said, he said, I'll wait at the moraine. That's what I'll do. If you don't come, I'll go, but I won't agree in advance. There was not time to argue, and arguing was not going to produce a different answer. I took the signal core from my pack and held it for a moment. Not for sentiment, but to confirm it was fully wrapped in the insulating material we had it layered in, which mattered because at -45, an uninsulated metal or glass object will bond to bare skin in under 3 seconds. It was wrapped. I handed it to Kel. He put it in his pack and moved east. I went west. What the Veth send after a relay theft is 3 trackers and a coordinator. I knew the coordinator was somewhere south, stationary routing signal. The 3 trackers were the ones behind me, on the ice field approach. When I cleared the southern margin at a pace I had carefully set, not a sprint, which would read as escape and trigger pursuit directly, but a deliberate ground-covering walk that would read as directed movement, as someone going somewhere specific. The carrier frequency shifted, active search going to directed pursuit harmonic. I had their attention. I moved toward the thin ice margin. One of the trackers broke from the unit. Psst. I heard the carrier frequency change, felt it in the ice through my boots, and I understood from the signal pattern that this was single tracker direct pursuit, which meant the other 2 had been given a separate vector. I did not look back. I did not need to. Frequency told me what I needed to know, and what it told me was that the unit had divided exactly as I needed it to divide. 1 after the thermal trace, I was laying on the western approach. 2 toward the bright orange flare that Kel would be setting on the eastern moraine. The thing about extreme cold is that it does not kill quickly in the way that films suggest. It kills slowly, by degrees, through a process that has distinct stages, and that a person who has grown up in serious cold environments can recognize in themselves and partly manage. I have managed to -37 before once on the plateau at 15. I knew where the stages were in my own body. I knew I was in the early vasoconstriction stage, blood leaving my fingers and toes. And I knew I had perhaps 40 minutes of useful function before the next stage made fine motor control unreliable. I reached the thin ice margin. I had my mark. A specific pressure ridge, low, granular surfaced, running east to west like a seam, and I used it to navigate to the safe crossing point, which was a 15-meter section at the ridge's eastern terminus, where the ice was solid to a depth of over a meter. Crossed it. 3 steps, slightly diagonal, the surface giving nothing under my weight. I turned and held position on the far side. 30 meters south of me, across the channel I had just crossed, the tracker arrived. The Veth are tall. That is the first thing you notice, and the thing that makes everything else recalibrate. The network briefings had dimensions. But dimensions are abstractions, until you see the actual thing moving across white ice toward you. It was perhaps 2.5 meters. Bipedal, moving with the efficiency of something that had evolved for movement over varied terrain. Each step placed with a precision that spoke of ground sensing capability far beyond what a human has. Its biology was encased in what I can only describe as a second skin. Not armor, not clothing. Something grown or extruded that was the same color as its body and moved with it and was part of it. Dark at the joints, lighter at the trunk. Its head was proportionally smaller than a human head at that body size. And it tracked me not by moving the head, but by some sensor arrangement that required no visible reorientation. It was moving with slightly more deliberation than its approach speed warranted, not struggling, but recalculating. The ice field environment was producing data that its baseline models were not certain about. And the deliberation was the physical expression of sensor uncertainty. It reached the thin ice section. I watched it read the surface. I could see the reading, a slight alteration in its weight distribution, front to back, as it assessed load-bearing tolerance. Its sensors gave it a confidence value. The confidence value was above threshold. It stepped forward. The ice gave, catastrophically, not like a film. The surface deflected, held briefly as the load redistributed, then fractured along the seam of the pressure channel, in a direction the tracker had not been vectoring from, a lateral crack that ran 3 meters east before the section collapsed. 2. The tracker dropped through into water that was approximately 2 degrees above freezing and approximately 1 meter deep at the channel center. It did not drown. The channel was not deep enough for submersion, and the Veth's physical capability was such that extraction was possible. What it could not manage, what its biology had no prepared response for, given that it was already operating at the far edge of its thermal tolerance, was the total shock of full immersion in water at that temperature. The immersion hit every thermal receptor in its body simultaneously, and the body responded the way any biology responds to a catastrophic temperature event. It prioritized core protection over everything else. Communications interface, which ran on signal that required a minimum level of background biological function to maintain, lost its link to the coordinator. Pursuit unit lost its coordinator signal entirely. The 2 trackers crossing the ice field toward Kell's flare. This meant autonomous fallback protocol. Return to last known coalition point. Hold position. Await relink. Last known coalition was the southern margin entry, 3 kilometers from Kell. They turned west. They walked off the ice field. They held position at the entry point and waited for a signal that was going to take several hours to re-establish. Kell walked off the eastern moraine. He walked south until he hit the network route. He did not run. He told me later that he had set the flare, watched the 2 trackers orient on it and start moving, and then he had sat down on the moraine rock and waited. Because that was what he had said he would do, and he was the kind of person who did what he said. He said he heard the ice fracture from 400 meters. He said it was not a loud sound, a sharp crack and then a lower rumble, brief and then nothing. He said he sat for another 10 minutes after that. Then he went. I crossed back over the safe traverse and followed him. The one in the water was not dead. I want to be clear about that. I stood on my side of the channel until it had pulled itself out of the ice and was upright on the south margin. 4 minutes, a process that was effortful but successful. And then I turned and walked east. I am not explaining this as mercy, though I do not think it was its opposite either. I am explaining it as what happened. It was out of the water. We were across the field. Those were the relevant facts and the only facts I was operating on. We found the Marte network's northern relay point, 4 hours south of the ice field's eastern edge. It was not a camp. A listening post, 2 people, heated by a buried fuel cell, stalked for a month. The man was Odd, which was the name Birta had given us. The woman never gave a name, and I never asked for one, because some people in that period were carrying names that they had decided to put down for the duration. And asking was the wrong kind of question. I gave Odd the core. He held it in both hands, turning it over. He looked at the surface, the black glass finish, the housing seams, the socket interface at one end. He did not say anything for long enough that I wondered if I had misunderstood what we had. Then he said, "Do you know what this is?" I said, "Yes." He said, "Do you know what we can do with this?" I said, "I know what you can stop. I don't know what you can build." He nodded slowly. He said, "That's the right order to think about it." He set it down on the equipment table, with care of someone handling something that had weight beyond mass. And he looked at the woman without a name, and she looked at the core. And something passed between them that I was not part of, and did not need to be part of. They knew what they were doing. We had gotten the thing north. The rest of it was theirs. He said, "You came from the ice field," I said. "Yes," he said, "Birta sent you." I said. She drew the map. He was quiet for a moment. He said, "We'll get people to her." And I believed him, not because I had reason to trust him, that I could articulate, but because of the way he had handled the core, and the way he had received Birta's name. He was someone who kept accounts. We stayed at the relay point for 2 days. We ate. We slept in intervals. Kel's hand recovered. The frostbite had not progressed beyond first stage, and the treatment we had done on the plateau had been enough. His fingers regained full color and sensation within 18 hours of warmth and food, and on the second morning he held the hand up and opened and closed it and said, with a precision that was very much like him, "Functional," as if he had been running a diagnostic. And on the second afternoon, while Kel slept, Odd sat with me at the equipment table and told me what he knew about the relay architecture. Not what I had known from Dahl's briefing, more than that. He had been working on the relay system's signal logic for 4 months, using recovered components and the accounts of the people who had passed through the post, building a map of how the network maintained the compliance protocols in the assessment graduates. He was careful about what he told me. He did not tell me everything, but he told me enough to confirm what I had been sitting with through the plateau nights. That the signal was not just communications, that the maintenance was real, and that the degradation was real, and that what we had brought north was not simply a tactical asset. It was evidence of a vulnerability that the network had been trying to prove for months. He said, "You've given us the thing we needed to test the theory." And I said, "What happens if the theory is right?" He said, "Then we have a direction." And I knew he meant more than direction, the same way Kel meant more than okay. And I let it sit there between us without pressing on it, because that was the right way to hold something that was not yet finished. We got out in February, both of us. That is the important fact, and I want to state it plainly, because accounts of things like this sometimes obscure it with other things. The rest of what happened, the use the network made of the core, the downstream effects of those uses, the events in Bodo and elsewhere that followed over the next several months, belongs to the people who did that work, and I am not the person to tell it. And so some of it. I know that there were more windows. I know that windows were walked through. I know that the compliance maintenance the Veth ran through the relay network had a degradation half-life, and that the degradation happened unevenly and over time, in ways that nobody has fully documented. I know that our father was different later. Not what he had been before month 7, different from what he was when he came home through the wire. I know that, because I saw his face when we came back from the north, and the distance in it was smaller than it had been, and smaller is not fixed, but it is not nothing. Cold is still in my chest. I expect it will always be there. Carry it, the way you carry anything you earned in a place that did not want you to leave, with the understanding that it is yours now, and that you are also, in some way that matters, still its. The night before we crossed the ice field, Kel said something to me that I have thought about more, than almost anything else from that period. We're in the shelter, as warm as we could make ourselves, the wind doing everything it could to the shelter's outer skin. And he said, "Do you think they understand what they came to?" I said, "What do you mean?" He said, "This place, this country, cold and the dark in January, and the ground that is trying to kill you 6 months of the year. They came here to take it. And it never occurred to them to wonder about what survives here. What had to get very good at surviving here over a very long time, because there was no other option and nobody was coming to help. I did not answer him then. I was thinking about our father, and Bearda, and Dahl with his exact information delivered in a cache months before we needed it. I was thinking about the harbor master's memory, and the communications technician's resigned thoroughness, and the runners maintaining the network in country that most people would not walk through in July. I was thinking about what you become when the place you live is genuinely trying to kill you every winter, and you stay anyway. Not because you are heroes, not because you have been trained, but because this is where you are from, and you do not leave what you are from. I said, eventually, no, I don't think they understood. Kel closed his eyes. He said that was their first mistake, and then he slept, because he could do that. And I sat with the wind and the cold and the specific weight of what we had come through. And I thought, yes, that was exactly it. You can occupy a place. You can route your signals through its infrastructure and assess its population and absorb its systems and calculate the load-bearing tolerance of its frozen ground with instruments that have never been wrong. You can do all of that with total precision and the complete and warranted confidence of a species that has not yet encountered anything it could not measure and manage. You cannot measure what the cold has made of the people who were already there. You cannot calculate what is left in a person after 17 winters in the northern highlands, what is built into them below the level of training or instruction or conscious decision, what they know about ice and darkness and endurance that they have never needed to think about, because they have never lived anywhere that did not require it. The Veth brought instruments. The instruments were accurate. The instruments could not read what they needed to read, because what they needed to read had no frequency. That is the whole of what I have to say. The rest belongs to the people who built something in the windows we made. I hope they built something worth the cold. I think they did.